here. So we're all in. Okay. So yeah, we are very, very grateful to be coming.
Not loud enough. Is it loud enough now?
Yeah, it's okay. Yeah.
If I can just mute some, I'm just getting a little bit of feedback. If you can just go on mute, folks, just while we introduce and get it going. But hopefully we can have a big chat towards the end in the middle of it. Thanks. So yeah, we are coming to you from the Snuneymuxw territory. We're very grateful to acknowledge, play, compete in this wonderful area of Vancouver Island. I work for PacificSport Vancouver Island. I'm the athlete coach services manager, and one of our pillars of services within the community is to provide some education. And the way we do this is we access our partners and some professionals to come in and speak to the community regarding some pertinent topics. So just a few housekeeping things. Yeah, if you just want to stay on mute, and then feel free to chip in with any questions. I know Alison's going to mention how to do that as well. And also, if you do want to chat, we encourage you to put your video on so we can kind of get that engagement, but that's entirely up to you. And just, yeah, if you want to chat, please feel free to chip in, and let's make it really engaging. So I will pass it over now to Alison Ellis, who has done a wonderful job in making some of these topics available to us. And last year we did a 3-part series, and this year we're doing a 2-part one on some items that are probably not spoke about in detail enough. So I'm glad we could get this going. So Alison, welcome tonight.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Kevin, and really excited to be here and to chat on this topic. I think it's a really interesting area, and so I really hope everybody enjoys it. So yeah, just a few sort of housekeeping items before we get going. So like Kevin mentioned, feel free to put questions in the chat box or unmute yourself to ask. As you saw, it is being recorded. So if you prefer to be anonymous, you could change your name to a food and write in the chat if you want. But like you mentioned, really encourage any engagement and conversation. If I don't get to your question during the presentation, there'll certainly be time for questions at the end. So we'll answer them then. All right. Okay. So just, yeah, a brief introduction to me. So I am from Victoria, played a lot of different sports growing up. Field hockey was my main one before switching to golf. And then I played at UVic there for 4 years. Returned to school afterwards to do a master's in kinesiology, and was really interested in the mental performance of Olympic athletes, and worked in mental performance for a number of years before returning to school to become a registered dietitian. And I really find periodized nutrition and just periodization in general is a very interesting blend and merge of those areas. So I think I'll try and tie that in a little bit tonight as well. And then did some additional training over at UBC with their head dietitian and their sports program. So yeah, excited to chat on this topic with you all. So before we get going, I would love to just hear if anyone has any specific questions that come to mind regarding periodized nutrition, or if anyone's currently using a periodized approach to their training. Feel free to just put in the chat. Would love to get a sense, and then can kind of incorporate and weave that through the presentation as we go. So I'll just sort of give a few seconds to maybe give that a little bit of thought, jot anything in the chat, and then we've got it in there. And I'll pop over to the next slide while you're kind of thinking of things. But again, please do put that in the chat with anything that comes to mind. But another question that I also am really curious about is what sports do we have attending tonight? I imagine it's quite diverse, so I would love to just hear what sports people are interested in. So again, if you wouldn't mind sharing in the chat, and then I'll try and bring in some relevant tips and things related to those sports. All right, so we've got triathlon, synchronized swimming, triathlon, kettlebell, long distance cycling, artistic swimming. Yeah, so already really diverse. This is fantastic. Okay, yeah, and if anything else comes to mind, just pop it in there. So another artistic swimming. Okay, very neat. Soccer, absolutely. Great. So this will be really interesting because of course there's a lot of individual differences with all of those sports, but we'll weave an activity through where you can really take some of these principles we talk about and try and relate it to your particular sport. So just a little overview of what I'm going to chat about today. So we'll look at what is periodization and look at some of the definitions that are out there and what this looks like, and then talk about a bit of a framework for determining periodized nutrition. What does that look like in those macro cycles, those meso cycles, and micro cycles? We'll talk about some specific potential nutrition interventions that could be incorporated, and then how this can fit in with your particular sport, and then some limitations and considerations for thinking about periodization. All right, so a little introduction. There's a lot of hype about periodization, and I do find it's kind of a buzzword. You type in Google and a ton of periodization books come up, and there's a lot out there on the topic. And there's a lot of different types of periodization. So I do want to just stress that going into all these different types of coaching periodization is certainly beyond the scope of this presentation. We'll talk about it really from that nutrition lens. But important to kind of just recognize, there's a lot of different approaches. Different coaches will have different approaches in different sports. All the different sports have unique demands. So certainly this is where, a coach comes in and looks at, or maybe you're doing it yourself and looking at that training plan and what that looks like. But recognizing those will be unique, and we'll be focusing a bit more on the nutrition piece of this. So periodization, defined in the literature as the purposeful planning and sequencing of different training units. So we've got long, medium, and short-term training cycles and sessions. And basically it's so that athletes can attain those desired physiological and psychological readiness for the optimal targeted performances on demand. So really lengthy definition, but I think the key when I look at this is those desired physiological and psychological. So our physical and our mental readiness so that we're performing at our best in competition. And that's where, when I first was kind of introduced to this, it was through a sports psych lens, and it was just like a light bulb. Like, of course, it made so much sense to kind of target different strategies at different times to allow for that kind of optimal psychological readiness at competition, so that we're feeling confident and focused and good attention and all of those things. I just wanted to highlight this paper here. So just because this is a really great paper that overviews some periodization approaches, and it looks at both from a sports psych lens and a nutrition lens and a coaching lens. It isn't open access, but if there is a way that you can get access to it, I'm just encourage it. It really lays it out really nicely. All right. So we'll just take a little bit of a look at, okay, so periodization, what's kind of a classic traditional one here. This is sort of the first type that I was certainly introduced to, where we've got like a kind of a yearly training plan, and would look at both the preparation phases and the competitive phases, and then the transition or kind of like recovery phases. These would be broken up into our general preparation, the specific preparation, and then leading into competition. And as you can see in this particular example, you've got your macro cycles there. The meso cycles would be in the middle, and then the microcycles are smaller. And we'll talk about what those are, but just wanted to show it as a little visual here. So this is just one for soccer that I pulled up off of the internet. Again, soccer having the unique demands of kind of probably 2 competitive seasons, perhaps fall and spring, maybe summer off season for some, maybe that's competitive as well. So again, those are some variables that'll impact that training cycle and the periodized approach for it. And then being a golfer, I will be talking a bit about some golf examples. So I just thought I would show this one. Just little things to kind of take away. So again, you're looking at the year, when are the competitions, when are the preparation phases, the competitive phases, and then when do we need to incorporate that recovery as well. All right, so let's sort of look at the periodized nutrition. So again, I'm going to read this definition, but we will kind of simplify it. So again, it's referring to that planned and that purposeful and strategic use of nutrition interventions to enhance the adaptations targeted by individual exercise sessions or periodic training plans to obtain other effects that will enhance performance long-term. So again, a little lengthy. So just simplified, basically we're doing changes in nutritional intake in response to certain periods of training. So really just kind of simplifying it down. And that's what this periodized nutrition is going to look at. How can we change the nutritional intake in response to different training and competitive demands? So if we think about that training periodization, again, that would either be developed with a coach, or maybe you're developing on your own, depending on when your competitions are and the training leading up. You've got your amount of training. So what is that output like? What's the volume of the training? As a running example, is that in a general preparation phase, a ton of mileage in a week, this person would be running. What's the type of training? Again, this is going to depend on the sport. Is it aerobic or resistance? Is it high intensity, intermittent? And then the timing. And then if we think about nutrition periodization, it kind of parallel. Well, again, we're looking at the amount, the calories to support that, the energy expenditure. So how much intake are we taking to support that? The different type are protein, carbohydrates, fat, hydration, and then again, the timing as well. And where periodized nutrition fits in is that intersect. So let's just, I just want to highlight this paper, and also, so there's no H there. I made the edit, but it didn't update on my presentation. So Stellingworth, I apologize to Trent, no H there, but Dr. Trent Stellingworth at the Canada Sport Institute. This is a great paper, a framework for periodized nutrition. He's done a lot of excellent work in, sport physiology in general, but also in periodization. And this is an open access paper, so anybody can access it and read it. It's just a really, I think, a great paper that kind of outlines things really nicely. Okay, so if we think about a framework for determining how we're going to adjust our nutrition for that periodized approach, first and foremost, it's really important to understand the specific sport demands. And honestly, whether this framework is for periodized nutrition or just in general, this is the framework I would take working with an athlete. We have got to understand what are those unique requirements of that sport. And I'll provide some examples in a second, but also looking at what are those key validated performance tracking metrics. So what are some things that we know are important for being successful in a certain sport? We'll look at what are the unique requirements of a particular athlete, and then are there any gaps, and how is the training reflecting closing these gaps or improving on those areas, and then looking at how can nutrition support those gaps within the training and competition. So let's look at some examples of what these would look like. So if you're ever wondering about the key validated performance tracking metrics. So honestly, if you went to Google Scholar and just Google typed in there performance indicators basketball, performance indicators soccer, performance indicators artistic swimming, any of those sports, likely something might come up. I actually haven't seen it for artistic swimming, but I was trying to pull on some of the sports there, but probably there'd be some articles on that. Certainly for these three examples, it came up right away. And these are helpful for just looking at, well, what are some of the things that have been shown to be support successful athletes in those particular sports. So let's look at the examples of unique requirements. So here again, as that kind of first step for that framework. So if we think of soccer, We've got a high aerobic component. There's a lot of endurance, but also high intensity and intermittent, sprinting and agility. There's a good focus and attention, quick decision-making and reaction, skill execution. So these are unique requirements to soccer, as an example. Golf, on the other hand, would be a lot more lower intensity, longer duration, being 4+ hours, much more fine motor control, still decision making, but not quite as kind of reactive and quick in the moment. And certainly focus. Swimming is another example here, very high intensity, short duration, potentially a lot of multiple events in a day, and could be very high volume for training. So I just want you to give some thought to your particular sport that you're interested in kind of thinking this through with, and think about that. So what are some of the unique requirements of yours? Is it quite aerobic? Does it require a lot of endurance? What is the focus like? Is there high intensity components as well? Because these really impact then our nutrition and our fueling for them. So I'm just going to give you sort of 30 seconds to think through that, and maybe jot a few things down on paper if you have it, about your particular sport. Okay, so we'll kind of build on this activity. So as you're thinking about those unique requirements of your sport, I also want you to think about, how do you want to feel like when you're competing? Is that feeling strong, confident, energetic, focused, whatever it might be? Just kind of, how do you feel when you're in your optimal performance state? Got you thinking about those unique requirements. Again, I already mentioned kind of those key validated performance tracking metrics, but again, thinking through, maybe jot a few down that come to mind for your particular sport, and think for yourself. So what are some of your strengths? Are there some gaps that you're working on, and how is training supporting these areas? And then we'll really be able to use this when we're looking at how can nutrition be periodized around some of these areas to support them. So again, just want you to take another maybe 30 seconds here, jot a few more things down based off of some of these questions. Okay. All right. So yeah, hopefully you're able to kind of, a few came to mind. I thought I would just put an example here. I used golf, although when I was doing it, probably would have been a lot easier if I picked a different sport. So I thought of unique requirements for golf, short periods of focus, but broken up over a long duration of a round, precision, fine motor control, some of the validated performance metrics that I'm aware of, drive distance, accuracy with irons and wedges, putting. So again, this is really golf specific, but I just wanted to provide an example, so to help you with yours if you're having any challenges, some gaps maybe that I'm working on, and then starting to look at how training can support some of these areas. And then we're going to link back to this. All right. So we talked about kind of those unique requirements, but just starting to think a little bit about those training requirements in a general phase, and then how that might kind of move into a specific phase. I just want to introduce that now, but we'll highlight this a little bit more once we kind of go through what this will look like. All right, so let's start to look at these macro cycles, or kind of the largest cycles, and then the meso cycles, that are in the kind of middle, and then the microcycles. So macrocycle occurs frequently within an annual training plan. It's all macro being the largest, so typically months in duration, or could be weeks. Could include the general prep phases or specific prep, competition, and transition or recovery. So just starting to think about what are some of the considerations. So what's the training demands of a particular block? And then what are those energy requirements? Are they quite high? Is it a really high intensity, high volume training, or what does that look like? Health considerations of a large kind of training block. So just starting to kind of asking those questions. And then we have the medium-sized training cycles. So typically weeks in duration or several days. An example might be a 2 to 3 week altitude training that an athlete might go to. So again, considerations are what, again, are those training demands? Because what are those energy requirements? Any particular health considerations? Are there competitions in this block? Any environmental changes, like I mentioned with the altitude training, for example, or maybe trying to get acclimatized to heat, different things like that. And then we've got the microcycles. So the small training cycles consist of days or within day as well. And we'll certainly look at what that would look like. So still looking at those, the overall load or the training demands, the energy requirements, but also starting to look at, okay, acute recovery, within day recovery, especially if there's multiple training sessions in a day, or kind of multiple competitions, where then certainly recovery is critical and very important. And any specific interventions that we're doing to support the training for competition. So as an example, maybe trying to adapt the gut to some carbohydrate fuel during a run, or something like that. And we'll talk about more examples, but just some considerations for these microcycles, or the smaller days or within days. So now let's look at from a nutritional context. So as you can see, it's quite convoluted coming up with that sort of yearly training plan, and looking at the periodization with the competitions and the general prep and specific prep. So let's look a little bit at what would this look like if we started to have nutrition to support that. So at the macro level, again, those large blocks, I'd like to highlight really looking at evaluating that energy output and energy intake. So wanting to make sure that we're fueling that particular training block. So say a runner, for example, is a 2-month off season, and the volume of their training is very high week to week, a lot of mileage, a lot of energy output. So really looking at, is this athlete fueling to support that really high output? So making sure the calories meet that high output. So would be assessing REDS here. Drawing a blank all of a sudden on what it's standing for, but when we're not meeting those fueling demands, we're at risk for not having enough fuel, and this can lead to hormonal changes and bone health issues and metabolism changes. And so looking at some of the indicators of, is this person under fueling, wanting to make sure that they're getting enough fuel to support that high output. And then starting to look at, okay, what are some of the potential nutrition interventions to support any health issues? So is the athlete at risk for anemia with iron? Is this where we would maybe need to look at supporting that because of their high volume? So just starting to think about some of these are examples of some nutrition considerations at that macro level. All right. And then at the Meso periodization. So again, looking at any aids that may match that several weeks, or where that the periodized approach is at this time, still really assessing for that energy output and intake. The prepping and planning now for nutrition to support the demands that may be coming up. So if you're thinking about maybe some specific competition prep here and wanting to start to get ready for that competition, maybe we're practicing that game day fueling for a 2 to 3 week period. Again, the environmental impacts, if it's a really hot environment or the altitude, hydration, iron are things that we'll kind of need to start thinking about. So these are general questions, and we certainly will look at a lot more specific what that would look like. At the micro level, because there's fluctuating day to day, this may be changes with our energy intake, even on a within day basis. So thinking about the different fueling around a training session, prepping and planning to support a daily schedule. Is the athlete going from a morning practice to a practice after school, and then weights in the evening? So how do we kind of prep and plan to support the nutrition within that daily schedule? So certainly the training sessions and goals of those sessions really dictate before, during, and after nutrition interventions. And then at the micro level, we're really looking at that recovery as well, making sure that there's adequate recovery, especially to support any subsequent training. All right, so we'll just mention, we can optimize nutrition as best as possible, but there still, of course, needs that training stimuli to see a response. But I just think it's really interesting when we do think about, if we think about the number of times an athlete's eating in a year, that's a lot of opportunities to really work on that nutrition periodization. That's get pretty good bang for your buck if there's 14 to 1800 eating occasions, and just in relative to kind of the training. So I did a 1 to 2 times per day, so about roughly 365 to 800 training occasions. So a lot of opportunities for eating and kind of playing around with that nutrition. Okay, so let's look a little bit at what some factors could be that can really support a periodized approach. It will be beyond the scope to explore every possible intervention, but looking at the macronutrients, and that'll be a bit of the focus that we'll look at. So the carbohydrates, protein, and fats, looking at how those can be adjusted depending on training demands and recovery. Micronutrients such as iron, I could have calcium in there as well as another example. I'm not going to look at supplements, but these again are ones if it through collaboration with a healthcare professional or a coach are often periodized within certain approaches. And again, I really will stress, just because I know there's probably a range in ages and whatnot, always weighing out kind of risks and benefits of these and making sure that it's appropriate for sport and age and all those things. So although they're certainly a component of periodized nutrition, just making sure that it's something that is kind of discussed with a healthcare professional with those. Okay. So here's an example, because I find it can be challenging. We hear, okay, carbohydrates and protein and fats, and we're thinking about the training, but to actually think about what this looks like. So I wanted to kind of put some examples. So just trying to move this video there. There we go. So macronutrient adjustment. So again, this is another paper by Trent, and this looked at differences in the macronutrients for a 1500 meter runner. So just to bring your attention, general prep, really high volume. So what this means here, 7 to 10 grams of carbohydrates based on the kilogram of the athlete per day, in this particular example and context. So that was to support that high volume of that training. So was fairly similar with the prep and competition, and then noticing in the transition or recovery, that dropped down a little bit. It was a little bit less just because that output has now decreased a little. Protein, again, fairly high to support that really high volume of training. During competition, there's not quite that same output, not doing that really high volume training, because now we've got the competition, there's likely a taper, getting ready for it, and then the energy going into the specific race or competition. So So the protein is decreased slightly, and same with the fats. And so if you look at I wish I had a little arrow, but if you look at under competition and then the total calories, so it'd be less here actually around the competition because the volume's decreased. So that just, changes those percentages a little bit of those macronutrients. So making sure, again, those carbohydrates are really supporting a really high volume in that general prep, appropriate for kind of around the competition. And then as output decreases in the athletes recovering, still very important to have all of those macronutrients, but it's just a bit less because the output is a bit lower. So again, the calories you can see are highest around that general prep, decreasing slightly around the specific prep, a little bit lower around competition, and then just not quite as high during that transition or recovery phase. And the reason there's a range is, of course, because there's going to be low intensity or higher intensity days. And so just within the days to support that. So I just thought that was kind of an interesting example of how carbohydrates could be really adjusted for the different phases of a training plan here. So building with a carbohydrate example and let's really look at these kind of nutrition interventions. So at the macro level, again, adjusting those carbohydrates to support the training phase. So when you have that higher volume training sessions, those carbohydrates will need to really support that and really make sure that you're getting enough of that energy intake for those particular phases. So again, these could be months. So it could be thinking, okay, for these 2 months, overall, those carbohydrate needs will be increased. An example at the weeks level, and I've mentioned this a bit earlier, maybe training the gut before for upcoming competition, and by training the gut, if you think, some people, have you ever found stomach to be quite upset or queasy, especially if you're trying to have enough food to support your training, things like that. So often when in a kind of a meso cycle or week cycle, you can practice training the gut to help with that. The gut does adapt. It's pretty amazing. And so by really focusing on that in kind of a week cycle of the training plan can help with that leading up to competition. And then again, an example with the carbohydrates. So enhancing recovery, increasing those carbohydrates around training, and also they can be used for bringing on training adaptations. I've got this as an example, but I mean, it could be an entire talk on its own about how just playing around with some of the carbohydrates with before and around training can result in different metabolic adaptations. So I do have and that's some people may have heard with kind of train low, compete high. And again, this is only for particular sports, but just want to show it as an example of how carbohydrates can be kind of adjusted within periodization. So in this particular example, it would be completing a few endurance training sessions with just reduced carbohydrate availability. And in this particular study did show that there was some adaptations for the skeletal muscle. And this is in an endurance sport. I think it was in endurance running. So, and this particular paper was a review paper on that. So it's not promoting this by any means, but just showing how it can be adjusted with a periodized approach. And like I put in the second point here, certainly a lot of work needs to be done on this area and weigh out the risks and benefits. But this little example here just kind of highlights what that might look like in this particular example. So this could be somebody who has, they've got their high carbohydrate pre-training meal, support that training, and again, the carbohydrates during to help with those glycogen stores and make sure energy is sustained throughout the practice, that post-training meal, and then maybe it's the evenings a bit low so that the next day when they train, they're actually training a bit in a lower state. And again, a lot of research is still needed on this area. And this isn't by any means suggesting this. It's just trying to provide an example of how the carbohydrates could be changed in a periodized approach here. All right. So let's look at maybe with protein and what that might look like. So at the macro level, again, adjusting the protein to support those training demands. So likely increasing the protein to support that output. So during a recovery phase, it might be around 0.8 to 1 gram per kilogram per day of protein. And these needs really increase. And these numbers, I find this is sometimes a limitation of sport nutrition. We get very bogged down with the numbers, and certainly if I was working with an athlete, rarely wouldn't be talking about these numbers. We'd be looking at, okay, can you get an extra, palm-sized serving of protein before and after your training? Things that are kind of a lot more tangible, and that's why I would use these numbers to guide that. But we will look at what does that actually sort of look like. At the macro level, right now, it's showing an increase to support that really high volume or demand. At kind of the week cycle, maybe it's adjusting the protein to minimize skeletal muscle mass loss. So it might be just increasing again, maybe it's an extra palm of protein before bed or with dinner, something like that. And then that micro within day, and this is where I really like to kind of focus with athletes, is how can we optimize it around our training, and what are the kind of the sources and the quality that'll really enhance that training. So can we have some protein within with some carbohydrates within that 30 to 60 minute window? What are the quality? Is it one that we can absorb and readily go to our muscles right away? With the availability of kind of the amino acids. So looking at some of those things to how best to support that within day. So here would be an iron example. So if we looked at the macro level, if somebody's got that increased training, but also of course, always taking into account the individual athlete, history, likely not likely, we would do blood work, but if they were really maybe struggling with some fatigue during these high volume training blocks, might look at, well, first we'd get that blood work to see where the iron's at, and then look at it, is a supplement needed? Are they struggling to get enough from a food source? So maybe that's incorporating that iron supplement over a few months to try and get those levels up. Again, at the Meso level, if an athlete was at altitude camp, maybe that's increasing that supplement even more to kind of help meet the demands of that. And then, like I mentioned, my favorite always that within day, I like looking at, okay, well, how do we maximize the absorption? Are we taking that iron supplement with vitamin C? Is it away from things that might be inhibiting some of that absorption? Timing it, away from that really intense training as that's impacting that absorption of the iron. Frequency of the supplement, are we taking it once a day or twice a day? So that would be at that micro level within, again, that training plan of just finding ways to best optimize that supplement. And then as we step back and look at the macro level, we'd be checking in, okay, after 3 months, how are the iron, how is the ferritin and the hemoglobin, how are those levels looking? Have they increased? And checking in at that kind of over a few months. All right, so getting back to that activity. So thinking about your sport over the course of a year. So how many competitive kind of seasons do you have? Like when I think of golf, we'd have the fall, we'd have the spring, and then even the summer there is quite competitive. So actually it'd be a short off season in the winter. So just giving some thought to when are your competitive phases, and then when would be those general preparation phases. I'm going to pull up some of those. Thanks, Kevin. Yeah, relative energy deficiency in sport for Reds. Yeah, that slipped my mind earlier, but yes, I'm just going to pull up the sports just to touch on some of those. So triathlon, for example, yeah, thinking about when are your competitions, and then kind of looking at that training plan around that. When would be that kind of pre-competitive phase? When's the general prep where you're getting in the really high volume of training of your running and swimming and biking, and how that kind of what that looks like. So just giving that some thought, maybe jotting down a few things on the paper if you started doing that. Same with kettlebell sport. When are those kind of competitions? What's the volume of training leading up? Is there kind of that taper leading into that competition? Just thinking about those kinds of demands and when those phases would be leading up to kind of competition, and then you can build out that plan from there. So giving all these sports some thought to these. And then we can start to think about, okay, so if those are kind of the blocks I've looked at the training requirements and the unique demands of the sport. What are the training requirements during those phases? So again, I just put a few here when I was kind of doing a golf example. So if it was kind of a general prep phase, there's going to be a lot of strength in the gym to support that distance for a golfer off the tee, agility and plyometrics, and then start to look at how can that nutrition support these areas. Same with thinking about your training requirements during specific prep phase, and then thinking about that output of a competitive phase. And again, what are the demands there, and how can nutrition support that? So I want you to just take again, maybe 30 seconds here or so, give some thought to the training requirements and your specific phases of sport, and just list out a few things, and then we'll kind of think about from those nutrition interventions that we talked about, how they could maybe play a role and support that.
Alison, I think it's fascinating, some of them sports, to try and plan for them. I think like triathlon, synchronized swimming, or artistic swimming, and the kettlebell sport, it must be very intriguing how you would plan for them particular sports, especially kettlebell, when you know that event, that competitive event, it must burn so much calories as the others as well. But that just brings to mind just the endurance and the power involved in something like that.
Yeah. And certainly look at that when we look at some of the limitations and challenges too of periodization. And sorry, I'm not sure if that was a question or kind of general comment,
kind of a comment,
yeah, it is really interesting. And I think at the bottom line is that it's challenging for starters. But then, looking at, so what are the demands? And that's where also that individual reflection, I think, can be so helpful for an athlete, in combination with kind of speaking with someone about this, whether that's their coach or someone, and noticing, okay, so if I, had that triathlon race or swimming competition or kettlebell sport competition, how was I during, the end of that? Did I notice any fatigue? Did I notice with loss of focus, or those kinds of things? And I think that can also really support how we then adjust the training and those particular blocks. But yeah, it's a great comment. And I think there's a lot of kind of challenges and different nuances with all of the sports.
Yeah. And I was gonna ask you that, is it important to have some repetition in your diet, so that when you do get to a important event, that is there's nothing coming out the blue, or there's nothing that's going to surprise you?
Yeah. So great question. And absolutely. And certainly this is something that I chat about a lot in just when working with athletes, is coming up with that game day nutrition. And so again, if we think about the different kind of macro, meso, and micro. This training that game day nutrition certainly can come in that kind of meso phase, or meso phase. I keep saying it miso like the soup, but
Yeah.
And that's where you can take a few weeks and really dial that in. So absolutely, I think it's something that should kind of be practiced before, and that's a great thing that can go into a periodized plan, taking 2 to 3 weeks, and maybe that's some tweaking. That's figuring out, okay, well, first of all, how far in advance am I somebody who likes to eat a really balanced meal 3 to 4 hours before, or maybe 1 to 2 hours before, and then just a little boost of carbohydrates right before. But that can definitely be really dialed in. And that's why putting that into a training plan, I think, can be really helpful, because that way, when a game day or competition day comes up, it's like, yep, I know this. I know that if my competition is at 10 a.m., I'm comfortable having something, you know, about 3 hours before. Maybe I want it to be like a low glycemic carbohydrate, or kind of like a low fiber, just because that helps my stomach. But that's something that absolutely, I think, practicing and then figuring out what works best for that game day nutrition. Yeah. All right. So hopefully everyone kind of thought a little bit about some of those different kind of training requirements there. And then, and like I mentioned, so I talked a lot about numbers, but sometimes just simplifying to what this looks like. So if we have a general prep phase with really high volume, often, increasing that overall carbohydrate and protein intake, but what does that look like? So maybe, and again, certainly some trial and error. Maybe we're adding 2 to 3 fifths of really high fiber carbohydrates, just to support some increase in energy in a day. And, this is, again, that ongoing evaluation. Okay, how are the energy levels? How is the training? Obviously, an athlete with high volume of training is going to be tired, but how is that recovery? Are you getting sick often? Things like that. Are indicators that maybe we need to up that a little bit more, and checking in with that sense. Same with the protein. How can we add 1 to 2 palm-sized protein servings, and what are some of those options that would support an athlete? Are we looking at somebody enjoy having, some extra Greek yogurt or a piece of fish or some extra seeds and things added to different meals, and how to add those in there? For practicing that game day carbohydrate or protein intake, again, that's, I think the better example is, Kevin, what you were speaking to about practicing that game day nutrition and jotting it down. So when I, tried this type of breakfast, I noticed that I had a really great practice or felt really good energy wise and focus wise. And kind of noting that. And then at the micro level, again, at the bottom, just timing. Okay, so I'm going to have 1 to 2 fifths of simple or kind of a low fiber carbohydrate around that training to just help with those kind of adaptations. And then a little bit of protein around those workouts as well to really support that recovery. And I saw a question come in there, so I thought it'd be a good chance to jump on that. So is there an amount of fuel an athlete can process during train or an event? So are you asking specifically about carbohydrates or calories? So maybe I'll speak first to kind of carbohydrates, but if I'm not answering your question, feel free to just correct me on there and I'll try and answer it. First and foremost, of course, there's going to be a lot of differences between people and the sport. So if we're thinking about a high intensity sport, and in terms of fuel, we are going to be looking at carbohydrates as that kind of primary fuel source. And I think you said triathlon. So if we're at a high intensity, we're going through those carbohydrate stores, those glycogen stores fairly quickly. So almost within kind of 30 to 60 minutes. So yes, we would then need to help kind of replenish those and carbs and electrolytes. Yes, so absolutely with carbohydrates. If something's a moderate intensity, I'd say if it's more than an hour, the recommendation is to kind of to get between 30 and 60 grams of carbohydrates for an hour or longer duration. If something's, again, really, really high intensity, that glycogen can be depleted a little bit sooner. But certainly in something like triathlon, fueling with a carbohydrate and electrolyte drink. So making sure there is some sodium in there. There there are the carbohydrates that are providing kind of 15 grams per 250 mils. So if you think about a water bottle being 500 milliliters, I think that's a great one that could have about 30 grams of carbohydrates in it. And then this is something when you're coming up with that periodized nutrition plan, is absolutely playing around with and incorporating and seeing how you feel. Do you need a little bit more carbohydrates in there, and checking in with, especially near kind of the end of that training. So that would kind of be in terms of amount, how much could at least help support that during training or event, that 30 to 60 grams for when that duration's longer than an hour. And not that you hit an hour and then start drinking it, but drinking it throughout to support so that those glycogen stores don't get depleted. Let me know if that answered that or not, but it's, yeah, great question. Okay, so like we were mentioning, really important to test and pilot these nutrition interventions. We want to absolutely test them, especially in those big general block phases, and noticing and checking in. We need to get back to kind of some of that intuitive understanding of our body and how it does. And I know this can be challenging with high intensity sports when they can suppress appetite at times. Maybe we're not hungry in some instances, then we do need to make sure we're getting that refueling nutrition afterwards. But in generally, really tapping in with how our body's feeling, how our energy and our recovery doing, how is our training and performance. So sometimes keeping a little log of those things can be really helpful. I put a few performance factors to consider, but to be honest, a lot of us don't have access to some of them, finding like a power output or force, but we can track our own speed for something, our heart rate, that GI or gastrointestinal, any discomfort or comfort. So that'll indicate food's working well or maybe not working well. So these are just some things to kind of consider when we're trying out these nutrition interventions. Like at the bottom, assessing, adjusting, and individualizing it. So always checking in with, okay, maybe that felt like too much carbohydrates today, or maybe we need to adjust that here and what's going to feel best. So just some considerations for sport periodization in general is that periodization is really complex because people are complex and athlete development is complex. It's amazing actually that a lot of the principles aren't necessarily scientifically validated, which I find really interesting, and a lot kind of either get passed on, but certainly periodization has been around for a long time. And I think just that purposeful planning is certainly really important. But another consideration is that just training is really diverse and varied, and huge variation with how a person adapts. So you could give 20 people the exact same training plan, and there will be huge within person variability in how they, in both different metabolic adaptations or strength and VO2 max and things like that. There's just a lot of variation among people. And then just thinking about yourself and what happens in a week of training. So I put in, back when I was maybe golfing, but thinking about all those different things. So all of your different training, and if you're working on the mental side as well, any visualization, things like that. Are you doing any strength training, any yoga as well? Maybe also working, and then we think of things even beyond just the sport with family and whatnot. So there's just a lot of kind of variables that can occur. And so that's part of the challenge with the research on sport periodization, is just there's a lot of kind of variables that come up. And then also the complexity of sport nutrition. So there's a lot of different factors that impact our nutrition intake, differences in hunger hormones, pleasure of foods, and emotions, and also culture and environment, and traveling and timing. There's just a lot of factors that impact our nutrition intake. And so it's so tough to accurately measure this. So if we think about those examples of going from a 1.5 grams per kilogram of carbohydrate per day to 1.8, or sorry, of protein per day to 1.8. Well, that's really challenging to accurately measure. So I think just recognizing that there are some limitations, because that is really challenging to do. I think, again, when we simplify it, it can be really helpful thinking, okay, well, based from yesterday, how could I boost a carbohydrate serving here? How could I boost a protein serving? So just some takeaways, and then would love to hear questions that people have, and any sort of discussion or comments that they have when they were thinking about this with their own particular sport. But like I mentioned, periodization is a popular term, but very complex, lots of variables. I think the key thing is that purposeful planning with flexibility and ongoing assessing and revising, that's really what's so key. We can kind of purposely plan. We can think about what makes the most sense, be flexible with adapting it as we go. And I think this can be most supportive for optimizing that psychological and physiological readiness at competition. Nutrition can certainly be planned to best support that training and those competitive demands. Many do require kind of specific protocols, especially if looking at some of the supplements. So for those, do encourage to talk to sort of a healthcare professional about those. But generally speaking, there's a lot that we can look at when we look at our yearly training plan, and then how nutrition can support that. So I'll come back to that slide in a second, but yeah, so I would love to hear if anybody has any questions or comments or thoughts when they were thinking through with their particular sport. Oh, I see a raised hand. Asked to. Yes, so Claudia.
Hi, sorry, I'm gonna lower my hand now. Okay. I kind of joined into this webinar maybe 30 minutes late. I was attending another one, so sorry about that. But my question is for my sport. I currently live in BC, and the weather is around 0 degrees outside right now in my area. And I'm training in my garage because of the lack of facilities where I can train in. But when I compete in my sport, it's in an indoor space. We just wear our karate gis, so I don't have to wear any jackets or under thermal shirts or thermal pants. But for my garage trainings, I'm freezing. And I realize I can't even break a sweat no matter how long I take to warm up, and I can move freely. But then I get hungry, like maybe within an hour after warming up. So I'm not sure if there's anything related to like the temperature and what I can do nutrition wise to help regulate that.
Yeah, interesting question. I think that's such a challenge with winters here in Canada, and especially then when we've got competitions that are like in a tropical place, or like you mentioned, indoors, or tropical. I was thinking sort of Hawaii, places where it is a big change in those temperatures. So yeah, that's interesting. I think one thing that comes to mind to support that is often if we're in a colder environment, and if there isn't the opportunity, like you mentioned with closures and things like that, if there isn't an opportunity to train in an environment that's similar, in the colder environment, sometimes it can be challenging to with hydration, to meet kind of those hydration needs, and to have that similar to when we then go somewhere a bit warmer. So sometimes that thirst is just a little bit kind of not kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Decreased a little bit when you're in
Yes.
your environment.
It is.
So
yes.
Yeah, so just highlighting some of those things and still having maybe a bit of like using, when we talk about the meso cycle or several weeks, adjusting a bit of that nutrition to be like, okay, well, I know I'm going to be going into a slightly different environment, going to be a bit warmer. What's that nutrition going to look like there? And can I still practice it here when it's going to be more challenging? Like it's likely easy to not drink as much, or maybe think, oh, I don't need to fuel right away. But that's where you could sort of practice that competition nutrition for a few weeks for the environment that you're going to be going into. So as an example, just checking in with that hydration for maybe, 2-week period. How much are you drinking within a day? What is that looking like? And checking in with hydration status. That can be sort of like urine color, even just making sure that adequately hydrated, and especially around your training. And then still focusing on that 3 to 4 hours. What does that nutrition best look like to support this? Again, even though it's a bit cold, and sometimes that even suppresses appetite a little bit. But those are some things that you could probably look at to at least get yourself ready for when the competition's in a slightly different environment.
Yes.
Let me
Thank
know,
you so
does
much.
that help at all to that answer?
Yeah, I feel like what I took from that is just understanding the similarities to, what I can do closer to a competition, right? Like trying to mimic a preparation to a competition. That's what I'm thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, definitely key takeaway, practicing that to get ready for the competition when it gets closer. And then maybe mentioning that, are there things that you can do now with that different environment? I think it would just be kind of that paying attention to best support it in a way that you can. So nothing comes to mind super specific in terms of, adjusting macronutrients for a slightly colder environment, but just best trying to support it overall for your training, and checking in with how you're feeling during that training, recognizing it's going to be challenging to, like you said, to warm up and to break a sweat, which is going to be a bit different, but still kind of focusing on that nutrition around those sessions.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you so much.
Welcome. Thanks. Great question.
I think that also speaks, Alison, to the importance of having that yearly training plan. And it's and I should have prefaced this tonight that we did a series last year where we addressed a lot of the fundamentals on macronutrients and what is a carb, what is a protein. So really wanted to enhance the learning, and that's why we directed this at High Performance Athletes. So I'm really glad, Claudia, that you're asking questions and you're probing these areas, because that's what we're trying to get across to the community, that there is a bit of a level up here, and that hitting on the yearly training plan, we can't, not all of us can afford a integrated support team like you have at the Olympics. But what you can do is you can talk to your coach, use people like us as a resource, and try and put it together, cobble it together yourself to give yourself the best chance to get to where you want to be.
Yeah, absolutely, Kevin. And that's even just that little bit of kind of that purposeful planning. I keep kind of coming back to that because I think back to my golf days, and certainly didn't have, an integrated support team, and kind of still looked at, what does this look like? And you're right, looking at that year from a big picture and laying out kind of the competitions, and then when that prep, and just getting some of that purposeful planning, and then taking that next step with, okay, where does that nutrition piece help support these? Absolutely. I think people can kind of, do that, and it can be really helpful with their training, and doesn't, because I think even sometimes when it gets to that really high level, that's one of the limitations I was trying to get at, is that, it tries to be so specific, but there's still so many variables within it. So I think just planning what we can and seeing what can be incorporated best we can is kind of the most helpful. All right, I'm just going to check the chat if there is any questions in there, or any other questions that come to mind for anybody. While you're thinking on questions, oh, yes. See if that. Oh, I don't know if that was the same hand or a different hand, Claudia.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Sorry. When Kevin mentioned the yearly training plan, I thought, yeah, I would really love to follow it to a T. And then I realized, yes, COVID has thrown a lot of things our way. And that also comes with my sport. There was a lot of postponements and sudden competitions that come up within a month, lack of preparation and all of that. So I have to replan my nutrition according to new schedules. And I was just wondering if there's any like quick tips to adapt to certain situations like that when it comes to going from a detraining phase. And then within a month, I'm told that I have to compete in February. So again, going back up to the heavy loading phase.
Yeah. So in terms, and just make sure there's kind of two things there. Quick tips. First one would be having foods that you know are supportive for your digestive system. That way, when if you have to ramp them up or ramp them down, they're ones that you know are fairly manageable for you and don't kind of cause any GI distress. And then in terms of kind of, and sorry, did you say going from like a really high volume to ramping up or ramping down? I just trying to remember the last part there, and I wanted to address that.
Yeah. So I just came back from a competition late December, and then I was told beginning of January that we have a tournament in February. Mm-hmm. So I was detrained definitely during the winter break, and then I just ramped up with the heavy volume now.
Right. Yeah. So another quick tip with that, again, that's where maybe some focus around the carbohydrates and protein around your training, and just increasing that a little bit in a day. Protein in particular. So that can again be something as simple as an extra palm-sized serving of protein, which would give you about that 25 grams. Adding that around your training sessions now, because that's going to support your muscle protein synthesis. It's going to support recovery and just getting ready to go into sort of competing. So protein certainly would be kind of a quick tip I would give, and also that frequency throughout the day of it. So I mentioned around training, but just making sure it's being included at each meal and snack. Sort of think of like a 5 times a day, just to best support with getting your body ready, like you said, to quickly turn around, go into a tournament. That's going to support recovery. It's going to support that body composition and that muscle protein synthesis.
Okay, sounds good. Yes, thank you.
And good luck.
Thanks.
I just saw another question coming here. So are there specific foods that can help you energize for help keep you energized for full days of training, 5 to 6 hours? So this, again, it's a balance with the gut as well and what it can handle, but certainly balanced meals with high fiber carbohydrates, protein and fat. Balanced meal will that'll help keep you full longer. If we have sort of quick carbohydrates, we're going to lose that energy a little bit quicker. It's going to kind of spike and then drop. So having really great balanced meals there where possible, making sure that fiber's up there and making sure you're getting that protein in the meal. So in terms of specific foods, again, it will depend on the time of day, but if you're thinking of breakfast, an oatmeal, hard-boiled eggs, adding some seeds on top, or some Greek yogurt. Again, I love seeds, so always emphasizing those, and some berries. Lunchtime, whole wheat sort of sandwiches or something that's whole grain, beans, things that are just, again, that really kind of high fiber, complex carbohydrates with some protein. Those will kind of be helpful for full days. And of course, managing that with the intensity of the training and what it can kind of handle. But that's something that it takes some trial and error, and would probably need a lot more probing questions too to get a sense of how that would best support that. But those are a few quick things. No problem. So if there, see if there's any other questions, but I did just want to mention, if you are, looking for more, certainly with registered Pacific Sport athletes and coaches, receive 25% off all nutrition services working with me. So if that's something that are looking for more support with. And then also, because again, with periodized nutrition, it's such a, like I mentioned, there's just a lot to it, and it really takes a lot of questions with somebody, because the individual circumstances are always so different with your sport and the person. So I did want to offer the follow-up session, doing 60 minutes at 25% off. And that's just to really look at how best can we get that nutrition to support your training and competition. I do find working at individually with people can be most helpful for really dialing that in. So I just wanted to leave that there, and that's on my website if you are interested. And there's a specific Pacific Sport 60-minute promo offer on there at kaizenmind.ca. Just checking. Kevin, did you see any other questions that I missed? Oh, can't hear you.
Oh, sorry about that. 2 years. How many years have we been doing this Zoom, and I still manage to make mistakes. I've just put the YouTube channel on the chat. We're going to upload this onto there, and also past presentations have been on there as well. So you'll be able to glean a lot from the series we did last year as well. It leads really nicely into this. But no, Alison, that was great. I think you covered a lot in a short period of time, and we could probably do a whole series just on this yourself, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
But I do encourage coaches, athletes to reach out to Alison. She's more than happy to help. She provides a great service. We brought her on board as our go-to professional in this area. So, and then if you are a registered high-performance athlete with a Pacific Sports Centre or a Canadian Sport Institute, then please reach out to Alison or myself or your local centre and figure out what benefits and services you can get. I'll also just plug a few things that we've got going on. So this time next week, we're doing part 2 of this series, and we're going to talk about gut health and inflammation, which is, again, a fascinating topic on how nutrition can impact that. And then also, if you've got topics that you'd really like to learn about, please reach out. We want to do these things for you. So reach out, let us know what you'd like to take a dive into, and we'll try and find a professional and present it to the community. So again, please reach out. We're midway through our Coach Academy right now. So we had an inaugural program launched in September where we're taking basically grassroots coaches or those who are just starting their coaching journey on an annual course, and they take all the intro NCCP courses as well as workshops like this on environment, how to optimize athlete learning. Basically, it's a yearly program called the Coach Academy, and we'll be taking our second cohort in September. So I just want to put that out there. It's an online program, so you can access it from anywhere. We've got people in from across Canada and the island. So look out for that on our social media streams, and feel free to email me if you want more information on that. But if you're looking to get more professional development and just really fill in the gaps between technical and tactical, then that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to create more awareness around that. And lastly, we're going to be launching some athlete bursaries over the next month or so. So please watch out for that, for some high performance athletes and also some grassroots athletes as well. And that's pretty much it from me. Alison, thank you so much again for the insights.
Well, thank you so much, Kevin, for having me, and really looking forward to next week as well, talking about, gut health and inflammation.
Awesome. So yeah, check on I'll upload this over the next couple of days on our YouTube channel if you want to check out the presentation. Thank you all for joining us. Oh, we've got a few questions here. So we are based in Nanaimo. We are Pacific Sport Vancouver Island, so our services are basically the Malahat North. However, we're moving with the times, and most of the stuff we do is online, and we try and get as many people in as we can, and we try and work with the regional alliance such as Canadian Sport Institutes, the Pacific Sports Centres, and Via Sport as well. And Alison is in Victoria. That's probably who you're asking about. But I thought I'd tell you anyway about us. Good night, everybody. Thank you for your time, and hopefully we'll see you all next week.
Yeah, thank you again, everybody, and have a great night.